Thank you so much, Ibrahim. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Rumi Forum, who I was telling Ibrahim earlier in our chat. I've been a fan of the Rumi Forum since I was an undergraduate at American University in the early 2000s. And I remember back then, I always hoped that I could be involved in the Rumi Forum. And, thanks God, here we are.
Thank you.
A big thanks again to all of you for being here. And of course, thank you to our creator, for none of this would be possible. So as Ibrahim mentioned, I'm going to talk about the humanity of Muhammad, a Christian view. But before getting into the details, I want to kind of frame our talk a little bit. And I want to make a historical reference to an infectious disease or plague. And I apologize for doing this. I know that this is in everyone's minds and it's on our television screen and all screens for that matter. But I think it provides an interesting framework for analysis. As some of you may know, plagues, epidemics are nothing new to our history as a species. We're certainly no strangers to them. And back in the year 250 AD, so we're going way back, 400 years, almost 400 years before the life of Prophet Muhammad, there was a massive plague within the territories of the Roman Empire. And this was one of the deadliest plagues in human history. And to give you some context here, historians tell us that in the city of Rome alone, during a single day, up to 5,000 people would die. So compare that to the height of the epidemic, the coronavirus epidemic in Rome or New York City. I think the height of those were like maybe, let's just put it this way, it wasn't as high as 5,000. So there were also eyewitness accounts of this plague. And we had an individual named Bishop Dionysius. And he wrote that although the plague did not discriminate, its full impact was felt on pagans, or let's call them non-Christians for the sake of this argument. And here's what the bishop wrote. Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. So in short, Christians were giving up their lives, their own livelihoods, to help those who were sick. And we have another quite interesting passage, and this one is from Cyprian, who was the bishop of Carthage around the same time. And he said the following: there is nothing remarkable in cherishing merely our own people with the due attention of love, but that one might become perfect who should do something more than heathen men or publicans, one who, overcoming evil with good and practicing a merciful kindness like that of God, should love his enemies as well. Thus the good was done to all men, not merely to the household of faith. So again, Christians were giving themselves up selflessly in the face of this pandemic. Now, these were remarkable efforts by the Christian community, because if you understand your history, in the hundreds and 200s and even the beginning of the 300s, Christians were a persecuted minority, especially in Rome. Here's another passage to give you a glimpse of life in Rome for Christians at the time. And this is from a document dated 130, the Epistle of Diognetus. That's the name of the document. It reads, there is something extraordinary about the lives of Christians. Like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose them. They share their means, but not their wives. They live in the flesh, but they are not governed by the desires of the flesh. They pass their days upon earth, but they are citizens of heaven. Obedient to the laws, yet they live on a level that transcends the law. Christians love all men, but all men persecute them. They live in poverty, but enrich many. They are totally destitute, but possess an abundance of everything. They suffer dishonor, but that is their glory. They are defamed, but vindicated. So in short, this this epistle of Diognetus is basically saying this is pretty remarkable that the Christians are basically hated by most people in Rome, yet they still act selflessly. So what is clear in these messages is that the people of Rome considered Christians to be an awkward or strange group. And the reason why they were depicted and perceived as such was primarily because they stood and loved humanity. They stood for and loved humanity. A selfless assistance to those in need, regardless of people's race, ethnicity, culture, or spiritual preference. And you know what's funny enough, when you engage with the scholarship on this matter, one of the reasons why the church and Christianity in general rose so quickly during the 3rd century was largely because of how Christians were behaving during epidemics and plagues. So what does this have to do with the talk and Muhammad? So I, as a Christian, I love to read about these stories of humanity, these selfless acts, heroes coming to the forefront during the darkest times that we as human beings face. And I also love to hear about the stories unfolding in front of our eyes at the moment. Though they're difficult to digest and they're unfortunate to comprehend, we have so many Christians coming to the forefront right now to assist brothers and sisters in humanity. And it is this very identification with love for humanity which also allows me to love Prophet Muhammad. So I want to explore this connection a bit more between Muhammad and humanity. But before I give you the precise details, I want to give you another frame of reference. There's a 2013 article published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and it's by 3 authors, Sam McFarland, Matthew Webb, and Derek Brown. And these 3 researchers actually developed a scale for measuring a person's closeness to humanity. And they called the scale the Identification with All Humanity Scale, or the IWAH. I'm going to refer to it as the IWA, the Identification with All Humanity Scale. So what does this IWA mean? IWA, in essence, relates to someone's level of concern for human beings, their supportive behavior towards the disadvantaged, their endorsement of human rights, and their responses in favor of global harmony. People with higher IWA care deeply about human beings without regard for race, religion, or other distinctions. People with a higher IWA tend to be higher in the personality traits of openness and peace. People with higher IWA believe that every life is worth just as much as one's own. In other words, people with higher IWA are able to transcend tribalism, transcend group boundaries, and they're able to see themselves first as a human rather than all of these other layers that we love to throw upon ourselves. And the results of this IWA test are quite interesting. I really encourage everyone to go dig into that. You can simply download it via Google. So let's transition to Muhammad. So my forthcoming book, which some of you may be aware of, it's called The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View, which is the title of this talk. And it really is fundamentally rooted in Prophet Muhammad's IWA. And it also sheds a bit of light on my own personal relationship with Muhammad and how I, as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, respect, admire, and even love Prophet Muhammad. The book has 7 chapters, and I'm going to name them in order. The first, religious pluralism. The second is civic nation. The third is anti-racism. The fourth, and which is the longest, by the way, is seeking knowledge. The fifth is women's rights. The sixth is the golden rule. And the seventh is the spirit of truth. I'm going to share with you a bit of knowledge on the first three chapters, which is religious pluralism, civic nation building, and anti-racism. So let's explore Prophet Muhammad's aywa. Religious pluralism. Let me be clear in distinguishing religious pluralism from religious tolerance. These two terms are different. For those that may have a daughter or a son or a friend with an annoying habit, and you tolerate some of these bad habits of loved ones in your life, there's something, how do you put it? I don't know. It's just something that isn't too great when you tolerate something. In light of religious beliefs and practices, when we tolerate other people's religious preferences, there's really no engagement with those unique traditions and unique philosophies coming out of specific religions. Religious pluralism is distinguished from tolerance in that religious pluralism is about the energetic engagement with religious diversity. Tolerance is just saying, you be you. It's standoffish. Religious pluralism is telling us, hey, we actually have to engage with humanity here. We have to engage with people. We have to eat with them, spend time with them, grapple with passages of our religious texts with them. I also refer to religious pluralism in light of a acronym called DEUCE, which stands for Dialogue, Education, Understanding, Commitment, and Engagement. This is something that puts religious pluralism into practice. It activates religious pluralism. Now, Muhammad did not merely tolerate people who did not identify themselves as Muslims. We know that he did tolerate them, but he was doing more than that. He was really embracing the humanity that God created, all of creation. And we have two primary examples that pertain to his relations with Christians. The first is the story of the Christians of Najran. So some of you may not be familiar with this story, but Muhammad was really, this is around 630. He was reaching out, sending letters to all influential regional, political, religious players. And he was basically announcing who he was, what he stood for, and what he hoped to achieve as the leader of this new ummah, this Muslim nation. And the Christians of Najran, Najran is a city today that's located in southern Saudi Arabia, close to the border with Yemen. And when the Christians of Najran got the first letter from Prophet Muhammad, they said, whoa, who is this person? Basically saying that they're similar to Christians, but they're not really Christians. And the Christians of Najran originally rejected Prophet Muhammad's invitation, but they later accepted the second one. So a huge delegation of about 80 learned men and a bishop travel from Najran up to Medina. And in Medina, a extraordinary encounter, perhaps the first encounter of Christian and Muslim communities within the boundary of the Ummah took place. And the story kind of unfolds something like this. The Christians and the Muslims were inside Prophet Muhammad's masjid, the mosque, and they were grappling over issues pertaining to Christology, so the nature of Christ. And the historical texts basically say that both sides agreed to disagree, which is completely healthy, right? We're not all going to have the same beliefs about everything. But when it came time for the Christians of Najran to pray, they were actually leaving the masjid. And instead of letting them leave the masjid, Prophet Muhammad said, you're already in a house of God. Why don't you stay in here and use this space, this sacred building, to engage and to worship according to your own conscience? So that's not, I don't think, tolerance. Prophet Muhammad was tolerating the Christians by inviting them to begin with, right? He was interested in learning about them, and he was not necessarily forcing his own religious beliefs or practices on them. But when he actually opened that door and said, use our space, there's something more happening here, right? This is this is his Iwa coming out, his identification with humanity. Makes you wonder, if he was in their shoes, how would he act? Would he not like to see the host invite the community, be warm, be egalitarian with the community, and welcome them in? Okay, I'm going to change gears and go to the civic nation, right? So a civic nation, the second chapter of the book, for those who may not be familiar with the civic nation, it's essentially a community of equal rights-bearing citizens. So the United States, ideally, in theory, is a civic nation because you can be a person of any walk of life. You could be of any race, creed, color, ethnicity, religion. What makes you an American is the rights outlined in the US Constitution, right? The Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All people are created equal. They are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There's nothing in there about you have to think this way, you have to look this way, and you have to be of this cultural orientation. Muhammad, I've argued in previous papers and books, envisioned a civic nation for his ummah. So he was actually saying the ummah is not just a space for Muslims, that the boundary of the ummah is actually quite flexible and it's really open and all-encompassing. So Muhammad's Iwa, again, is expanding. And when we look at the Constitution of Medina, we see that Prophet Muhammad, as kind of a head of state, is agreeing to some very clearly outlined policies that are documented in the Constitution of Medina, which basically say Jewish people have freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, the right to own property without any interference from the state. And that was unheard of at the time. If you understand your history of especially Jewish people facing persecution pretty much everywhere they go, Muhammad is basically doing the unthinkable. He's creating a new type of nation that is not anchored in race, ethnicity, or tribalism, right? So he's saying, let's let humanity into this nation. Let's make all people right-bearing citizens. And if you look at various articles, like Article 25 of the Constitution of Medina talks about a shared political community, which is the Ummah, and that all members of the nation, if we can call it that, are basically one body. It's a pretty remarkable document. Some scholars say it's the first constitution in the history of the world. Let's move to the third category, which is that of racial equality, or what I refer to as anti-racism. So we know in the 6th and 7th century, racism was rife in Mecca specifically, and also around the Arabian Peninsula, and really probably around the world, as it still is, unfortunately. But Muhammad came with a really courageous and fearless vision of a new type of nation, as mentioned in the civic nation part, that really stood for racial equality. This idea that all human beings are creatures, sons and daughters of God, and that God made us all in his image, and that we're fundamentally equal. And we see Muhammad's position, we see his Iwa, his identity with all of humanity, in several developments throughout the course of his life. One is the relationship that he had with Bilal ibn Rabah. So for those who may not be familiar with Bilal was a slave from Northeast Africa that was living in Mecca. He wasn't being treated well. He had a darker skin complexion, and he was othered for the simple fact that he was born a certain way, that he came into this world looking a certain way. And because he looked a certain way, he was automatically marginalized within the Meccan community. He was obviously automatically placed as the kind of traditional other. And when Prophet Muhammad got to know him, he started realizing that this was a great man. And Muhammad even defended Bilal in front of some of Muhammad's beloved companions. Al-Ghifari is one, and Al-Ghifari had told Bilal, they had a dispute, and Al-Ghifari was literally screaming at him saying, "You're the son of a black woman, you're the son of a black woman." And Muhammad said, hang on, if you're considering yourself or if you're identifying yourself as one of my followers, we don't do this racism stuff. And Muhammad literally said, you have the state of ignorance, of jahiliyyah in you. And this idea of racism isn't going to fly. We also see Muhammad's positions on racial equality in the farewell sermon, basically the last speech that he gave to the Ummah, the Muslim nation. And in this speech, the farewell sermon, Muhammad said, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A white has no superiority over a non-white. A black, no superiority over a non-black, something like that. It's not quite literal, but basically saying that all of these groups are not superior to the other, except in piety and in good action. Except in piety and in good action, right? So Muhammad is taking a stance. He's saying, yes, we're all equal. What makes us kind of superior in an ethical or moral way is how we conduct ourselves, the values that we have inside our heart and our mind, what we do for humanity, our positions on Iowa. And what's remarkable about this farewell sermon is that it almost identically mirrors Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which was given in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And Dr. King said something actually almost identical. He said, I hope that one day my 4 children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? So we have a really interesting connection there between the farewell sermon, Prophet Muhammad, and Martin Luther King Jr. So those are the 3 themes that I've covered there. And there's 4 more in the book. Seeking knowledge, which is a really interesting chapter because I look at various periods of Islamic history and I looked at how Muslims used knowledge from the world and kind of meshed it together and synthesized it and created a new type of knowledge, right? This identification with all humanity, love of knowledge for the simple fact of loving knowledge, not caring where it's coming from or who is giving it, just embracing it because it's part of God's creation. It's part of God's love and God's vision for us. And then women rights carries on in a similar light as racial equality. Muhammad pushing the boundary on equality of the sexes. And I look at the life of Khadijah and Aisha. And then I look at the golden rule, and I really, in this chapter, compare a lot of passages in the Quran and the Bible and look at things like, compassion and mercy and love and peace. And then the last chapter is called the Spirit of Truth because there's a passage in the Bible that essentially says something like Jesus was forecasting another kind of prophet to come along and he would be the Spirit of Truth. He would come to kind of reinvigorate my teachings. And I'm perfectly comfortable with identifying Muhammad as Spirit of the Truth. So let me wrap up. Let me say a few last words about Iowa to kind of let all of this sink in. Iowa is at its core about human rights, the inalienable rights that our ever-present Creator, God, gave us the moment that we entered into this world. Iowa is understanding that people have the right to live according to their conscience and to do so as long as they're not being harmful or threatening to peaceful environments. Iowa is putting yourself at risk because you feel empathy towards outsiders, strangers, the destitute, the migrants, the foreigners, the asylum seekers, and so on. Putting yourself at risk. You know how easy it would have been for Muhammad to just have pleased his opponents at the time and just say, I'm not going to go with this idea of racial equality, or I'm not going to go with this idea of racial tolerance. Muhammad's life would have been so much easier if he didn't take those moral stances. But he did the hard thing because he knew it was the right thing. So taking risks is really part of Iowa too. So let me wrap up too by giving you another sad but inspiring story. And it actually has to do with World War II. So we've covered a remarkable amount of territory here, starting in the 200s in Rome, and now we're ending in the early 1940s in France. And there was a French pastor named André Trocmé. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he lived with his wife. And in short, these two individuals, along with their congregation, their Protestant congregation, saved thousands of Jews in the Holocaust. They were part of a small village in southeastern France. And during the war, they caught wind of this persecution happening, and they started hiding Jewish people in their homes, in their stores, and other kind of institutions and buildings in the small village. When the deportations began of Jews in France and elsewhere in 1942, Trocmé urged his fellow Christians, and this is a direct quote, to give shelter to the people of the book. This is a Christian using this phrase, the people of the book, which is found many times in the Quran. And despite the danger, Trocmé courageously moved forward. And he moved forward with these bold deeds, not out of nowhere. He did so because he believed in Jesus, and he believed in the nonviolent teachings of Jesus. When the authorities eventually caught wind of Trocmé's leadership and suspected that he was hiding Jews, the Nazi authorities and their French collaborators became angry, and they started questioning Trocmé. And Trocmé had an amazing quote, and I'm going to read it directly. He said, "These people came here for help and for shelter. I am their shepherd. A shepherd does not forsake his flock. I do not know what a Jew is. I know only human beings." This beautiful story makes me think about one of my favorite stories about Prophet Muhammad, and I'll end here. One day, as a hadith relates, Muhammad and some of his companions were sitting around. As they were conversing, a group of people could be seen far away in the distance. The group of people slowly came into focus, and when they were about 100 or so feet away, Muhammad realized something that was quite important. He realized it was a funeral procession, and yet it was not a typical funeral procession. When this group of people got closer, Muhammad realized that this was the funeral procession of a Jew. So Muhammad, out of respect, slowly got up off of his feet. And one of the companions turned to Muhammad and said, and I'm paraphrasing, "But Master, this is the funeral procession of a Jew. Why are you standing?" And Muhammad said something absolutely brilliant and so simple. He just said, "Is it not a human soul?" If one hadith and one life experience of Muhammad captures Iwa, it's that. This is one of countless reminders of Prophet Muhammad's humanity. I'm only really scratching the surface. And all of these examples that I've raised here, and all of the ones that I have not, but are documented in the book, are in perfect harmony and directly in line with the spirit of Jesus, who is certainly his kindred spirit and his brother. That's about 25 minutes. Thank you all so much, and looking forward to engaging in some questions now.
Thank you very much for this stimulating, illuminating remark, which I believe has been triggering a number of questions as I see on the screen. And let me start with the first one. When did you start this research? This is Mustafa asking the question. This research study, what triggered you? Did you study Jesus as much as you did Muhammad? I'm asking this, no offense, please, just to make a point that Jesus is mentioned in the Quran more than Muhammad. An interesting similarity if your answer is no.
Thank you, Mustafa, for that question. So there was never any one point in my life where the kind of light bulb went off and said, I'm going to study Islam. I'm going to study Muhammad. I can't remember that moment ever happening, but let me explain to you to the best of kind of my recollection. When 9/11 happened, I was 16 years old. I was living in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, in a town called Needham, about 30,000 people, 98% of which were white and Christian. And when 9/11 happened, I had absolutely no context whatsoever for what just happened. I had never met a Muslim in my life. I had never been to a mosque in my life. I didn't know anything about Islam or Muhammad or about any of the things that were being thrown at me in the media. And the invasion of Iraq happened shortly thereafter. The invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq both happened, and a drone war in Pakistan happened. And I was in college at this time, and these were kind of difficult times. And I was in Washington, D.C. at American University, and I had to figure out what I wanted to study. And I decided that I wanted to answer the question of why did 9/11 happen? And I went into this question with this kind of assumption that Muslims hated, Americans, or Muslims hated Christians. And long story short, I got into a life-changing class with Professor Akbar Ahmed, who has spoken at the Rumi Forum before. And one of the first things that Prophet Akbar Ahmed said was a famous hadith, one of many about knowledge, which I talk about in the book, which is the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. And this one passage really shook me up inside. It really kind of rocked me and humbled me, because I had all of this stuff in my head, which was misinformed. And I was actually upset when I realized like how little I knew about that thing that I wanted to study, which was Islam. So I became really fascinated with knowledge and the ability of knowledge to shape our hearts and minds. And not only knowledge in the sense of books and articles and academic theories, but knowledge that I could potentially get through human interactions with embracing my fellow Muslims and my fellow human beings. So really this journey is not simply about Islam or Christian-Muslim relations or finding similarities between Islam and Christianity. My friend, it's about knowledge. It's about the power of learning and the ability of knowledge to bring us closer together, to find common ground, to make this world a better place. And for why I focus so much on Prophet Muhammad is because I spent a huge chunk of my early life studying Jesus and becoming familiar with Jesus. I was raised Catholic. I'm still Catholic. So I know so much about him. And when I started studying the life of Muhammad, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I started realizing, wow, they are kindred spirits. They are kind of brothers in humanity, sharing a similar Iwa. And then all of your points mentioning Jesus's reverence in the Quran, I wish more Christians knew about this. And I wish more Christians could look at these positive depictions of Jesus in Islamic Holy Scripture and just say, this is beautiful. This is great. This is a way of moving forward and progressing in Christian-Muslim relations. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Yeah, that's the layout of the book, and definitely its content. This brief presentation about it encourages, I assume, non-Muslims to revisit what they know about Islam. And as a Muslim, I have to admit, it should be encouraging Muslims to revisit what they know about Islam, as today we see not every practice of Islam is about something that we can be proud of. So here is another question asked by Arzu Zahir. Where can we get the Iowa scale? I've found the website, iowalab.com. I'm thinking this is it. Where do I click? What the Iowa test? Is this available for the public yet?
So there is a 2013 article by the 3 authors that I mentioned. And these authors are, let me get you the exact names, Sam McFarland, Matthew Webb, and Derek Brown. The article was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. That's the one article I was referring to. It's relatively short. It's only about 5 pages, but McFarland has published extensively on Iowa. And there is a website which he is connected with as well. So it was actually remarkable. I only came across the Iowa test today. I was putting this talk together over the last 48 to 72 hours. And I was like, what type of theoretical framework or conceptual, foundation can I lay out for people to really walk away from this talk with a buzzword, a one kind of quick hitting, message or word that can capture all of this. And I came across the Iowa, and I was like, wow, Iowa will probably be with me for quite some time. And I'm actually looking to dig deeper into the results of McFarland's research. I haven't really dug into it. This is all kind of fresh to me.
Thank you. Here's another question. I'm wondering how your study of Islam, Muhammad, has enhanced, supplemented, or changed your own practice of Christianity.
That's a great question. And I was actually thinking about that a couple minutes ago. So it absolutely has fundamentally changed my view of Jesus. And I think this deserves its own Zoom session as well. There are some elements of kind of traditional Islamic thinking on Jesus that I agree with. As a Christian and as a Catholic, I'm careful, if I can put it this way, with the concept of the Trinity, knowing that the Trinity has extensive reporting in the Bible, but also understanding that the concept of the Trinity really didn't emerge, as a very kind of creedal element of Christianity until hundreds of years after Jesus's death. And I think there's some legitimacy to this argument. Now, personally, do I think that a Christian has to believe in the Trinity to be a Christian? I do not believe that. But I also believe in the Trinity, if that makes sense. I know that the Spirit has been with me for better and for worse. I obviously believe in God, and I definitely have a relationship with Jesus. But a lot of Christians would condemn me as a heretic by saying, well, this idea of the Trinity, maybe it is kind of man-made. But with this, though, let me also be clear, like a lot of Muslims that I've engaged with, especially on social media, don't really understand what the Trinity is. And I think what we need actually are more Muslims who really understand what the Trinity is, and to understand that it does not mean three gods. The Trinity does not mean three gods. We need more Muslims articulating to their fellow Muslims what it is. So the last point I'll say here, my studies within the Islamic tradition and kind of Christian-Muslim relations, especially as it pertains to Jesus, has really pushed me to think a bit more critically about Jesus of Nazareth versus Jesus as Christ. So Jesus of Nazareth is Jesus. It's who he was according to what we know through the gospel and the reportings in the other books of the New Testament. And this is going back to this idea of when the Trinity came along. Jesus as Christ is something different, I think, from Jesus as Jesus from Nazareth. I think there's a distinction there, and I think a lot of Muslims would agree with that. So, it hasn't, studying in the Islamic tradition hasn't fundamentally changed my views on Jesus, but it has shaped them. I'll say that. Good question. I mean, I could really talk about that one forever.
Thank you. Here's a question by Tariq about the book. Specifically, I teach Islam at college level, and I wonder if your book targets college students as well. Is it an easy read? And let me just widen a little bit. Who is your audience in addition to that question?
So I think the very end of the first chapter, I talk about who the audience is. The audience really is everyone. I think a high school student could read this book and maybe be a little challenged when I start talking about, the difference between pluralism and tolerance, or the difference between racism and anti-racism. It may get a little hairy for a high school student, but it's open in the sense that a general reader would be able to digest it. So one thing I really try to do as an academic, as a public intellectual, is to take a theory and a concept and to be able to explain it and to lay it out in a way, again, that, your average Joe would be able to understand. So I'm very confident that the book will be stimulating to high school, college, and even academics as well. This isn't a hyper academic oriented book, but as I laid out in my talk, I am dealing with serious sociological concepts and theories. So I do think it could be enriching to someone in their ivory tower, if I could say that.
And we have another question from Akif Aydın that comes from Atlantic Institute, our co-host of this event. First of all, excellent presentation. I've truly enjoyed. While your remarks tell Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, embrace the other faith groups and respect human fellow regardless of their faith. But many non-Muslims think and believe the exact opposite way. So what are your suggestions to educate those people who have the misinformation about Islam and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him?
So I think it has to be a multi-layered approach. I think there's only so much that can be learned by telling someone, read this book, or visit this scholar's website, or visit this intellectual's social media page and read about what they have to say about Muhammad, and trust them. I think learning through traditional knowledge like books is important, but I would also encourage some of the individuals that you identified. I encourage them to interact with people. I think we can really learn a lot about each other's faith traditions through human experience. I know for me, that's been the most enriching and the most valuable. And in the talk, I mentioned this concept of DEUCE, which is dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement. This is activating pluralism, looking at pluralism as a process, as an action. And let me also encourage all, let's say, Christians out there who want to learn more about Islam. I think the first thing we need to do is have interfaith without interfaith, which is basically, before we dive into scripture and before we dive into Christology or the teachings of Muhammad, we have to develop trust between people. You can't just bring two strangers together to a table and say, okay, we're going to look at Quran verse, etc., chapter. It's not going to work. You have to develop trust and rapport. And I suggest that we do interfaith without interfaith. Let's talk about being humans. First and foremost, let's talk about what it's like to be a son, a daughter, an employee, a member or a citizen of the United States. Let's talk about more neutral things. Once we develop some relations and some solidarity, then we can dive into the education and the understanding. So I also would like to add to this question too, a lot of non-Muslims, if I can say that, have certain misunderstandings about Prophet Muhammad. Let me also add too, like in my own experiences, there are some Muslims who hold the same views as these Christians who hate like Muslims, if I could say that. So like this idea of like Islamophobia and like a group like ISIS, which I'm not even sure really exists anymore, but like these are two sides of the same coin. A Christian who looks to a verse in the Quran and says, the Quran is saying to kill the kafir, to kill the Christians. Some Muslims actually believe in that as well. So like we have extremes, regardless of whether they're Christian, Muslim, or whatever. And we need to find ways of engaging with these people, obviously without putting our lives in danger, but like, how can we bring them into the kind of tent of humanity, and how can we engage with them? I think this is a serious concern and something that we have to keep in mind going forward.
Thank you. And Fatih Yüzel is addressing something that could be like a follow-up question, which is about why his followers have been depicted in ways they don't deserve. And also, as you said, their understanding of non-Muslims. So what went wrong with his followers? So there is this ideal example that the Prophet put into practice, which stands as a landmark story. And then there is the historical practice that needs scrutiny and that sometimes, went different directions. So what went wrong?
That's a really good question. And it also happened with Christianity. And it's still happening with Christianity, with people who have these, these lifestyles or these worldviews that you just look at and you compare to Jesus's life and legacies, and you're saying, what went wrong? So I'd say it's really human nature. I think some humans love power. They're greedy, and they're willing to twist and turn even something as sacred as religion to meet their own self-fulfilling prophecies and their own interests. So I think there is a natural component to it. I think human beings, I mean, even going back to the story of Adam and Eve, like this idea that humans can fall off the righteous path. They can be misguided by Satan or Shaitan. I believe in that. And I believe that people get corrupted. But they get corrupted because there's a kind of spiritual disease within them, that they become infatuated by things like materialism, by fame, by status. So there's things that happen within inside of us that makes things go wrong, as you mentioned. But then we also need to remember that a lot of the animosity towards certain groups of people, regardless of whether they're Christians or Muslims, are manufactured. And today we see a manufacturing of like anti-Muslim sentiment. We see it in the media. We see that the media tends to only depict Muslims in light of violence, in light of war, this idea of war on terror and terrorism. So a lot of people are programmed to think this way, which is really unfortunate. And I also think if you go into history as well, I think scholars have also, I wouldn't say failed, but I think scholars need to do a better job of making their knowledge more public. I think especially today, like scholars need to be active on social media. They need to be active in the public sphere, and they need to be bringing their knowledge and challenging these kind of extreme narratives in the public light, so more people can learn. I'm concerned that throughout history, there have been people with all of this insight and wisdom, and they haven't shared it because they're kind of comfortable in their office or their ivory tower. So it's there's no simple answer to your question, but human nature, the fact that anti-Muslim sentiment is programmed, and also we need scholars that are more active in the public sphere.
Thank you. And let me take advantage of my role here and address my question.
Sure.
Which is about I think the 5th chapter of the book about women's rights.
Yes.
So this ideal practice throughout the history, for a number of reasons you mentioned, was from time to time, not systematically, but here and there, was distorted and what was eroded because of certain ambitions. So how about the perspective, the jurist approach, the jurisdiction, and the general understanding of women as individuals, as believers, and as people with different roles? How this influence women in the Muslim society? So I'm asking the question. What prompts me is that there is this argument that there were some engineering that made Islamic jurisprudential schools more masculine, and that came afterwards, and it was masculine feminine balanced in its origins.
Ibrahim, I wish I could really give you a detailed answer about the jurisprudence, but that's not really an area I could really break down. And I'm just kind of being humble and honest here. But can I say a few things, kind of big picture on Muhammad's teachings, right? So we had Muhammad come with revolutionary practices on the incorporation and the position of women in a given society. And a lot of people today need to recognize how drastic these changes were that Muhammad initiated, really bringing women up to par with men. And again, understanding that there are certain rights and obligations that men and women have, all of that kind of natural stuff. But I think a lot of his perspectives on the position of women is due largely and thanks to Khadija, his wife, and she being successful, powerful as she was, I think her influence kind of humbled Muhammad too. I think perhaps he was like, wow, okay, she's impressive. This is a very successful woman. And I think he was perhaps he was humbled by her. And I don't mean that he was ever arrogant. I just think that she was a positive influence on him. And then, I think one example too that people often forget, Muslims and non-Muslims, is one of the first universities, arguably the first degree granting university in the history of the world, was Al-Qarawiyyin, and the Al-Fihri sisters creating the first university in the world. I think it was in like the ninth century, towards the end of the 9th century. So just simple facts like this, simple examples, can go a long way in challenging some of these more conservative jurisprudence rulings that have come in subsequent years. And I think too, it goes back to what I had mentioned previously with this kind of corruption of the soul, corruption of the heart and the mind, and human beings, whether they're men or women, becoming obsessed with not sacred things like humanity or equality, becoming obsessed with worldly matters. How can these individuals maintain their status? How can they increase their wealth? How can they enhance their knowledge, their power? I think at the root of these conservative rulings that have happened throughout the centuries, excluding women from the realm of influence, I don't think it's really a theological thing. I don't really think you can defend excluding women through the life and legacy of Prophet Muhammad. I think it's a human creation. I think people are just corrupted. Hopefully I managed to get around that question a little bit, Ibrahim.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as someone who is engaged fully in interfaith work, I take specific note of not rushing into the text study without really getting into this rapport and developing that, which is the very foundation for a fruitful shared study of the text.
It takes, effective interfaith dialogue takes time. It takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes commitment. And I really think we need to look at it more as a process rather than these kind of simple meetings that just happen. Trust is not something that is automatic. Like even with our relationships with our loved ones, like this idea of love at first sight, and this idea that, oh, I knew this person, I knew I could trust this person from the minute I met them. That's the exception. That's definitely not the norm. And with all human relationships, it takes time. It takes people being more familiar, being more open, being more comfortable. And we need to approach it as such. We need to be careful with it and take our time and be methodical and deliberate.
Thank you very much for this engaging talk. Thanks to our participants for their insightful questions and curiosity. So please follow Rumi Forum updates, as we have upcoming events, one on Muslim women and the other on pluralism in the coming week. And also feel free to reach out to us if you are interested in our Ramadan program of pairing Muslim, non-Muslim households via Zoom for virtual iftars. So we are getting just used to this whole new story. I thank everyone wholeheartedly for this lovely exchange and look forward to seeing you in upcoming Rumi Forum events. And Craig, thanks once again for
Thank
this
you,
great
Ibrahim.
talk.
Thank you all. Take care.